SEP Fanfic Readings presents 1,000 Words by Olive Juice 28.
Chapter 10. Crossing the Threshold. That evening, while all 10 of them were gathered around the dinner table, the door to the room opened to allow the headmistress and a familiar redhead entrance into the dorm. "Bill!" Hermione exclaimed when she saw him, rising from her chair to meet him with a hug. Dean also came over to grasp the eldest Weasley's hand, and Luna waved from her spot with a dreamy smile on her face. Professor McGonagall glanced at all of them, making sure she had everyone's attention, and then began. "I would like to introduce you to your head of house, and your Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher for this year." Cheers and applause rang out around the table, and Bill responded with a wide grin. "I shall let him properly introduce himself and answer any questions you might have for him," continued McGonagall, once they had quieted. "Professor Weasley, please stop by my office once you're finished here." Nodding briskly to him, and then the group of students, she swept out. "Well," began Bill, "as stated, I'm to be your head of house this year, and the defense teacher. McGonagall approached me about a month ago asking if I would consider taking the position for 1 year, and it just seemed like a good timing. Having been a cursebreaker for so long, I know quite a bit about the dark arts, and I was happy to take it on and stay closer to home, since Gringotts was getting ready to send me back to Egypt." "Where's Fleur?" asked Hermione, settling back into her chair. "She'll be here tomorrow. She's finishing packing some things up, and then we'll both be here. We've got quarters in the castle, and she's taken a job at a shop in Hogsmeade to keep herself busy," he explained with a smile. "Will we be battling boggarts in your class?" Neville asked, slightly nervous. "Neville," chuckled Bill, "you fought Death Eaters firsthand. You killed that great nasty snake. You single-handedly created a hiding place for students right here in this room and led a revolt against the Carrows. I really don't think you have anything to worry about when it comes to boggarts." By this time, everyone was laughing, and even Neville seemed to think he was worrying unnecessarily. "But, to answer your question," Bill continued, winking, "no, I'm not planning to unleash any boggarts on you." Everyone laughed again, and Neville breathed a visible sigh, his cheeks pink. "McGonagall also wanted me to let you know that since you aren't under any prefects or head boy, head girl, that issues, questions, concerns, and the like should just be brought directly to me. I will be checking in on you regularly to make sure everyone is doing all right and that no one is getting up to mischief." At this, his eyes twinkled. "Well, at least not too much mischief," he chuckled, as did everyone else. "Anyone have any questions about schedules or need anything in your dormitory?" A few questions were asked, but nothing of any major importance, and Bill reminded them about their upcoming introductions to their first years the following morning. "Anything else?" he asked the group at large. "What did you think of the match between Pride of Portree and the Hollyheads last week?" Dean asked, and with that, random conversation started to break out around the table. Bill hung around for a little while longer, making sure to speak to each student for at least a few minutes, approaching Draco last. "Malfoy," he began as he walked up to the tall blonde. "I heard what you did for George at the shop. For my whole family, really." Draco, who was still uncomfortable with all the new positive attention he'd been receiving, just shrugged and shoved his hands in his pockets. "It was nothing," he started to mutter, but Bill cut him off. "It most certainly was not nothing," he said firmly. "You have no idea what it means to everyone, what good it's done for George." He clapped a hand on Draco's shoulder and shook his head, his voice thick. "Mom said George has been living in the flat above the shop again, moved back in the day after the portrait was hung. That's huge." His voice constricted even further. "He would still be locked up in his room at the Burrow if you hadn't come up with that idea. I will forever be grateful for it. We all will." He stared into Draco's eyes, his own filled with unshed tears, and Draco found it difficult to meet his gaze. He nodded and stuck out his hand to Bill. "I'm glad it's helped," he said sincerely. Bill grasped his hand tightly and shook it, his gaze still locked on Draco's. "I think this is going to be a really good year, Malfoy." Silver eyes met pale blue, the former with anxious hopefulness, the latter with genuine encouragement. "Yeah, I hope so," Draco said with a small smile. Before turning in that night, most of the housemates were waffling between unpacking, checking out the other rooms, and preparing for the next day. Draco let his curiosity lead him across the common area to the girls' side of the dormitory, wondering what their rooms all looked like. The first room, at the top of the hall, he knew was Hannah's, as he had seen her go in and out of it several times already. She didn't appear to be in it when he poked his head in the open door, but her apparent love of polka dots was obvious. Every piece of fabric in the room was covered with circles of all sizes. Her bedspread and hangings were a pale yellow with red, green, blue, and darker yellow dots in various sizes spread all over. Her curtains were pale green with very tiny dots splashed about it in a haphazard way, and her chair was blue with a large circle cushion in Hufflepuff yellow. Draco moved on to the next room, where he found Hannah sitting on the bed that clearly belonged to Luna. The ethereal blonde was digging through her trunk at the moment, chattering about her dwindling supply of butterbeer corks. She straightened and turned upon hearing him enter, both girls now peering at him with interest. Hello?" he mumbled. "Hello, Draco," sang Luna happily, floating over to him and placing her hand lightly on his arm. "Have you settled in all right?" "Yes, thanks," he replied, feeling oddly at ease in her company, seeing as he'd never really spent any time with her before. "You?" "Oh, yes," she stated enthusiastically. "The room really knew what I would like." She gestured around her chamber. Like Anthony's, much of her room was a shade of blue, but the designs were centered around stars and magical creatures. Her curtains and comforter were cornflower blue, and constellations clearly visible in shades of green, gold, and red. Her rug and her chair were both a pewter gray, with the silhouettes of bowtruckles, nifflers, fairies, and phoenixes interwoven throughout. On her bed was a large white pillow with a bright yellow flooper in the middle. Draco couldn't help but grin. The room did seem to know its occupants very well. He turned his attention to Hannah and nodded in her direction. "Hello, you must be Hannah." "Yes," she offered a warm smile. "We've never officially been introduced, but I know you're Draco." He dropped his gaze, feeling slightly embarrassed by the thought of what she probably knew of him over the years. "Do you like your room?" Hannah asked, and he could tell she was trying to help him move past the awkward introduction. "I do." He looked up at her and grinned again. "I don't know what I was expecting our dormitories to be like, but it's beyond anything I would have imagined." Both girls nodded in agreement, smiling back at him. He bid them good night and continued his way down the row of doors. The next door was shut, and he didn't wish to bother whoever might be in there, in case she was already asleep. He moved down to the fourth door, hearing two voices talking animatedly. "Hey, Draco," greeted Daphne with a friendly smile. She was putting clothes in her dresser drawers, while Padma was sprawled on the floor with a magazine. She, too, smiled at welcome in him. "This is your room, then?" he asked his former Slytherin companion. "Yes." Daphne's eyes lit up, and she glanced around the room. "I absolutely adore it." Her bedspread, like Draco's, was a silver silken material, but that was where the similarity ended. While his had a single large design in the center, hers was covered with thick glittering strands of ribbon in the 4 house colors. It made an elegant grid of sorts, and her curtains matched exactly. Her rug was black with a paisley pattern of various shades of the same 4 colors. Her chair was a deep emerald green, and her bed hangings were an almost sheer red. The bolster pillow on the floor near Padma was a pale blue with an intricate circle of ribbons in the center. He nodded, knowing that this was definitely Daphne's style. She had always been the most feminine and fashion-minded of the girls in his year in the Slytherin dorm, and this room was straight up her alley. "You can pop over and see mine, too, if you want," offered Padma. "It's the last one, next to the girls' bath." "Thanks," said Draco, surprised that she would trust him with that, but he took her up on it nonetheless. Padma's room was like a burst of color after Daphne's more polished design. Her bedspread curtains and rug all contained mandalas and sunburst in the house colors on a background of pale green. Her chair was a sunshine yellow with a large fuzzy cushion in Ravenclaw blue. Her bed hangings were white with dots of red, gold, green, and blue randomly spaced throughout. Draco thought back to the bright-colored robes the Patil twins had worn to the Yule Ball in 4th year, and knew this room suited its new boarder very well. He peeked back into Daphne's room, addressing the black-haired girl. "Your room looks great." Padma simply grinned and nodded in agreement. That meant the room in the middle was Granger's. He glanced over and saw that her door was still closed. He hadn't actually spoken to her since arriving, except to ask her to send the basket of rolls down to him at the other end of the table. He'd caught her watching him at least twice, but she looked away immediately. He didn't know what to make of it. Taking one last look back towards her door, he headed off to his own chamber across the room, realizing it was in the middle, just like Hermione's. For reasons he didn't try to figure out, the similarity made him smile. Hermione, meanwhile, was struggling. Right before dinner, an owl had swooped through her open window and dropped a letter on her bed. As she was already halfway out the door, she decided to wait until after she ate to read it, assuming it was from Harry or Ginny. However, she had quickly learned upon returning to it that it was a response from one of the healers she had written to. This time, a wizard from Peru had replied with what she perceived to be very sympathetic, yet very pessimistic suggestion. He told her, as the others so far had done, that he did not think the spell could be reversed. He apologized profusely, saying he could not imagine how difficult it had been for her, and that he thought she had been very brave. Unfortunately, he encouraged her to hold a memorial service for her parents in order to give herself closure. He basically wanted her to act as if they were dead, a thought that sent her into hysterics. As the words on the page had registered, she quickly shut her door and cast a silencing charm so her new housemates wouldn't hear her sobbing. Her parents were not dead, and she would not behave as if they were. She would not give up. It took her almost a full hour to compose herself. Several times she started for the common room, only to well up with tears as her hand closed around her doorknob. She didn't want the others to see her in this state, so she waited until she could be absolutely certain the storm had passed. By the time she ventured out, only a few people were around. Neville and Dean were playing chess at one of the small round tables, and Hannah was curled up in a chair by the fire with a book. Hermione decided that it looked like a good idea and turned back to her room to grab something to read. As she emerged the second time, she spotted Draco coming out of his own room. He stopped when he saw her, and she gave a small wave in greeting across the vast space. He started towards her, so instead of heading to Hannah, she took a few steps in his direction. She observed him during dinner, intentionally keeping her distance so as not to influence anyone's impressions, and was pleased to see her new housemates had treated him with the same amiable cordiality as everyone else. In turn, Draco made every effort to engage those in around him in a similar fashion. She'd had to force her gaze away from him several times, lest she be caught staring, but she couldn't deny that she was being drawn to him in some way. The logical portion of her brain tried to pass it off simply as reading too much into the similarity between his scent and that of her amortentia, but the rest of her decided that the coincidence only added to the minor fascination that had already begun brewing under the surface. "Granger," he said as he was still a few paces away. She tilted her head with a slight smile on her face. "Haven't seen you much since I got here." "Oh," her smile faltered. "I was just finishing up some things." She trailed off, and she thought about the letter. She glanced back up, and he was watching her, searching her face. She forced a bigger smile and asked, "Are you all settled in, then?" "Yeah," he said, shrugging. "Didn't take too long. The room is rather spectacular, isn't it?" He glanced around at the high ceiling and stone fireplace. "Absolutely." "You like your room, I assume?" He nodded. "You?" and waved towards her door. "Want to see it?" Draco tried to play it off as if it didn't matter if he saw it or not, but he really, really did want to see it. For some reason, hers was the room he was most curious about, although he couldn't quite put a finger on why. He simply nodded and shrugged, shoving his hands in his pockets and following her back over to her chamber. She pushed open the door a little further and beckoned him inside. He took in the space, noticing the light, airy, and very inviting feel the room had put together for her. It suited her, just as all the other rooms suited their occupants, but he had an unexpected appreciation for it that he didn't for the others. It was simple, compared to some, but intrinsically welcome, and held a warmth that signified coming home. The room was comforting, no frills, but still beautiful. Just like her. Draco's eyes widened and his heart jumped to his throat. Where had that come from? He was very thankful she happened to be facing away from him at the moment, as she had turned to place her book on the shelf. He schooled his features back to a polite look of interest, and met her gaze squarely when she looked back over to him. "I brought it." She pointed to the dresser, and he followed her direction. There, on the top, next to the wooden jewelry box and the small figurine of an otter, was the picture of her with her parents they had talked about in her living room. The wind was blowing, and they were laughing again, and Draco smiled as he had the first time when he watched the small family together. "Looks great," he said honestly. He glanced around the room again, turning his attention to one of her nightstands. On it stood 3 picture frames. The largest contained a photo of Hermione with Harry and Ron, from Scotland, or third year by the look of them. They had their arms around each other and were laughing at something unknown to anyone but themselves. Another frame held a moving photo of a squashy-faced ginger furball he recognized as her cat, Crookshanks. The animal was clearly displeased with having its picture made, as he kept glaring at the camera before turning around and sitting with his back to it. The smallest frame held a muggle photo, as the subjects weren't moving. It was another picture of Hermione with her parents, this one from before she would have been old enough to attend Hogwarts. The 3 Grangers were sitting in front of a brightly lit Christmas tree, dressed in festive sweaters and grinning from ear to ear. "Christmas is my favorite holiday," she explained, seeing what he was studying. "I can tell," he said, smirking. "That was taken the year I was 9, she went on. "My parents had gotten me tickets to see the Nutcracker Ballet as part of my gift. I had been begging them to take me to see it for almost a year. We took that photo right after they told me." "The Nutcracker?" asked Draco, thinking that didn't sound like a pleasant or child-friendly thing to watch. Yes, she chuckled at his look of distaste. It's actually a magical story. I have the book somewhere. You can borrow it if you like. He mused. I'll think about it. As he continued his perusal of her room, he noticed an envelope on her bed. Heard from Potter already? He joked, knowing that she'd only been back in the castle a day longer than he, but sure that the friends communicated regularly. He was surprised to see her countenance fall and a small frown crease her brow. No, she shook her head and gave a small huff. It was another reply from one of the so-called experts I contacted about my parents. She glared at the letter now, and he guessed what the missive had contained. No luck, then. No, none at all. Her voice was lower and full of disappointment. She continued to stare at the letter, but he could see her eyes were now bright with tears. In that moment, he desperately wanted to say or do something to bring the smile back to her face, but he was at a loss as what would help. That wasn't the last one, though, was it? He asked, crossing his fingers in his pockets, hoping that was not the wrong thing to say. No, she brightened slightly. It wasn't. I've still not heard back from 14 of them, and I won't give up until I have, and maybe not even then. As she spoke, she stood a little taller and pushed her shoulders back and raised her chin. He saw a flash of that famous Gryffindor courage and admired her refusal to accept defeat. He wondered what it would be like to have someone believe in him so fiercely. Good, said Draco, causing Hermione to look at him questioningly. You shouldn't give up. There are always new magical discoveries, new spells, new potions coming out. Any day something could be found that will help them. The hope and gratitude that filled her eyes as he said this made him feel like he could achieve anything. He felt a flicker of that same hope within himself, and it brought a warmth he'd rarely experienced. It took all of his self-restraint to not move closer to her, even though he felt as if he were being tugged by an invisible rope in her direction. Instead, he allowed his eyes to meet hers for a long moment, as a genuine smile spread across both of their faces. Thank you, Malfoy, she spoke softly. Her fathomless brown orbs, still wet with unshed tears, now sparkled with possibility. He didn't want to break the connection he felt with her, but he also knew he couldn't continue standing in her room, grinning like an idiot for the rest of the night, so instead, he nodded, shrugged, and took 2 steps towards the door. See you at breakfast? She asked, still watching him. Yeah, sure. He tried to sound nonchalant, but felt like he was failing miserably. She nodded, and he took 2 more steps, passing through her doorway, and he heard her call out, I hope the toast meets your standards of perfection. The comment was followed by a small giggle. He grinned to himself as he made his way across the room to his own chamber, and a smile was still turning up the corners of his mouth a bit later as he fell asleep.